Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Without further ado, let's go through your a little bit of biography and introduction, and then perhaps we can get it started.
Sure. I'm a human rights activist. I've worked in the human rights field since 2007. I work for the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in New York that focuses on helping people who live under authoritarian countries around the world. We do a variety of civil liberties work, including advocacy events, campaigns, trainings. We help people learn how to fundraise better, how to market themselves better, how to tell their story. We connect activists to people who can help them, to journalists, philanthropists, policymakers. In doing this throughout the years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the role of technology in human rights. We've used a lot of technology to get information into closed societies. We've used a lot of technology to help people understand how to communicate privately with one another and achieve freedom in that way in cyberspace. And then more recently, we've looked at the financial aspect of this and looked at how Bitcoin is a tool for human rights.
Well, I'm glad that you brought technology, and obviously the topic of the podcast is about technology and the social impact. So now what that we see specifically with COVID, everything becoming digitalized, and how did that impact the human rights and the freedom of speech as you are an activist in this field?
Well, obviously, a lot of governments used the excuse of the virus to crack down on civil liberties and human rights. This was most apparent in dictatorships. People were forced into sort of lockdown type things in China, of course, a year ago. And the Chinese government introduced a whole range of kind of intrusive digital surveillance practices relating to your status, whether you were potentially contagious or not. And this was digitized in apps with different colors. A lot of this has not completely disappeared from life. So there's an old saying that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. So a lot of these regimes around the world kind of like passed new laws or restrictions or regulations on gatherings and protests, and not all of these things have been reversed. So in authoritarian countries, it's been a pretty significant impact. Obviously people in open societies can fight back more, but not so much people who live under dictatorships.
But even like in democratic countries, like, Western countries, Canada, US, they're still, not the US mostly right now, but even before, but Canada is still forcing the lockdown and restrictions, even though obviously we are going through statutes and civil liberty and all these kind of like freedom of speech, freedom of movement. And how do you describe that? And what has been done through your foundation to kind of like bring awareness? Is it education?
At HRF, we don't work on open societies. So we're not going to do like a press release on Canada.
Right. Yeah. But what is your perspective?
We did a whole event called CovidCon. I think we did the world's only event on, it was a big interactive conference that you can go to look up on covidcon.org, I think. And we had a 2-day event on the intersection of the government response to the virus and civil liberties. So we had speakers from all over the world. I'd recommend you check it out. And
since most of your activities on the authoritarian regimes, mostly perhaps Middle Eastern countries, Asian countries like China. So if you can elaborate
more than 90 countries all over the world, all over.
It would be great if you can educate all of us, including me. I'm not as active as you are in the field. Perhaps what is going on? Because obviously media censors everything, right? This podcast, we don't censor anything.
Okay.
And in terms of what is happening in the world, obviously, we don't hear that much of, for example, authoritarian, as you said, 90 countries. This is a kind of like a news to me, and I'm sure that the audience would also.
I see. Yeah, absolutely.
So if you can, elaborate, that would be great.
53% of the world's population, about 4.3 billion people, live under an authoritarian regime of some kind. There are popularly known ones that are famous, like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Iran. But there are many other countries that are lesser known, or maybe known, but people don't know how actually tyrannical they are. Perhaps Vietnam or Uzbekistan or Nicaragua, or places like Equatorial Guinea, even places that are lesser known, like Turkmenistan, Laos. Unfortunately, many countries in Africa, ranging from Eritrea to Uganda, to the Republic of Congo, until recently Angola. You have places like Western Sahara and West Papua. So there's many places in Latin America, in Africa, Middle East, in Europe. You have Belarus, right in the heart of Europe. You have places in South Asia, obviously. You have, Iran. You have atrocities unfolding in Burma right now. You have things happening in East Asia with North Korea, and Xinjiang, and it's unfortunately a global phenomenon. The upside, of course, is that democracy is also a global phenomenon, and for every Cuba you have a Costa Rica, for every Belarus you have an Estonia, for every North Korea you have a South Korea. So that's a good thing.
And how do you see the technology can play out, either as a good cop or as a bad cop? We see that, for example, the big tech, most powerful tech companies, they're really, they're not even afraid of anything. Obviously, they're just like obviously censor contents, block, deplatform individuals, or even we've seen in cryptocurrency, people have been kind of like thrown out of Twitter 5 times. How do you see technology can be playing in a good or in a bad way, and what is the best way that we can perhaps make the kind of like balance in that?
Well, there's different kinds of technology. There's big data analysis and AI, and people who use cloud computing and our ever expanding ability to compute large amounts of things and interpret them together. And these are authoritarian technologies. These are technologies that empower surveillance and control, social engineering. Then you have more citizen-focused technologies like encryption. Encryption is neutral. It can help anybody. So it can help a dictator, but that would be missing the forest for the trees. Really, the powerful thing is that it helps everybody in the dictatorship, all the citizens. I think you can say the same thing about a mobile phone with a camera. Sure. It helps the dictator, but obviously much more important is that everybody who has one now can be a citizen journalist, right? So this is where Bitcoin comes in, and it's similar. Like, yeah, bad people can use it, but that would be missing the forest for the trees, in as much as literally anyone with internet access can use it. So there is a struggle between centralizing, big data analysis, AI type tech, which when linked to data streaming off of your phones and your accounts is really pernicious. And then ways people are fighting back, whether by trying to hold their authorities accountable through smartphones, or encrypting their messages and trading them privately with apps like Signal, or by using Bitcoin to opt out of the financial system. These are technologies that are more freedom focused, obviously.
In a broader perspective, we always hear that, in the different discussions, even like in Clubhouse, that Bitcoin fixes everything, not just in financial industry that we see, but like in, for example, social, and there's like so much social aspect to that. If you can broaden up this topic and explain a little bit more in details in terms of human rights, how can we use blockchain technology, encryption, and specifically Bitcoin to solve mainly of these like social problems that we have? Sure.
Yeah. Look, obviously, I think at least the creators of that meme did not mean it literally. Bitcoin obviously does not fix everything. If my phone breaks, Bitcoin does not fix that. However, the point is that it fundamentally changes many things about our world, and it truly does have. It will have an impact over time on a surprising number of things and a surprisingly deep number of things. In as much as its simple surface level impact perhaps is as a savings technology for people who live under bad currencies. That would be like kind of an obvious way that it helps people. If you live in a currency, in a society where the currency is collapsing, obviously, if you can save in Bitcoin, then the government does not control the value of the Bitcoin. It cannot just print more. So that's, I think, quite powerful. But you dig a little deeper and you realize, oh, well, actually, it's also this like censorship-resistant payment network where maybe a foundation or an activist group can receive a donation without being censored, and they can go exchange it for fiat if they need to. And like basically, it's like this full stack banking service for individuals where they can receive, store, and send money without needing to trust corporations or governments. So it's like this really powerful freedom tool that connects people from around the world. But you keep digging deeper, and then you realize, oh, it's actually quite geopolitical as well. Like for many decades, the world has used the American debt as the reserve currency. US Treasury is what governments save. Like central banks used to save gold primarily, right? And then we went into this Bretton Woods system where instead of gold itself, it was really dollars that they were, dollar assets that they were saving pegged to gold. But after 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. He no longer would redeem dollars for gold. So we really developed into this sort of treasury bill standard, let's say, where like all these governments around the world hold US debt as their savings asset. But that's starting to unravel a little bit. People are worried about holding US debt, I think, more worried than they were 20 years ago. So maybe we're going to enter the Bitcoin standard where central banks hold Bitcoin actually on their balance sheets, or at least quite a bit of Bitcoin. That's personally what I believe is going to happen. So, there's different levels to this. I mean, it's a financial tool to protect savings. You dig a little deeper, again, it's a human rights tool, but you keep going and it's like something that may disrupt everything about how nations interact with each other. So this is sort of what we mean when we say Bitcoin fixes this. It's a kind of a fun way of describing just quite how deeply transformative it will be on our world.
You mentioned about Iran. You mentioned about China. I want to know about your opinion on the 25 years old agreement between China and Iran that they announced I believe a month ago or so, and they even didn't disclose what the agreement details was. How dangerous is that we live in a society that transparency is really important, but at the same time, authoritarian regime can easily, without even consensus of their, population, right, agree to either economic, financial, political agreements that they don't even disclose to their society and to the people. Well, how dangerous is that?
It depends on whose perspective. It's not very dangerous for them. If you're a dictator, it's great, actually. But all governments obviously have these secret deals, like even the sort of deal between the Saudi Arabians and the US, where the Saudis had to denominate oil sales in dollars and then reinvest the dollars back into US debt, like in exchange for weapons and protection. This was not all of this was public. Some of this was classified. So even when democracies are involved, there's quite a bit of backdoor dealing, right? It doesn't really matter about regime type. All governments are, trying to keep things secret from their populations. I think it's a little harder to do over time in a democracy because we have free press, whistleblowers, and we reveal things about our government. Like in democracies, we're spying on our government, okay, and holding them accountable in a way, right? It's very difficult to do that in a dictatorship. So yeah, it's probably worse for, harder, certainly for citizens to find out what their government is doing. It's like it's not like you can file a freedom of information request in China or Iran. The government is going to put you in jail if you try to file a. If you go to them and say, hey, I want to find out what happened over there, they're going to be like, oh, really? Okay, you're going to go into this prison over here. Whereas in America, reporters can file FOIA requests, and they can win. And then that's how we find out what happened. So all governments do shady business. It's just sometimes in democracies, we have the tools to actually shine some light in there. Unfortunately, for folks who live under authoritarian regimes, they don't really have those options.
In terms of using cryptocurrency, I think looking at technology and how it's been developing, and I believe at this age that we are today, obviously blockchain, AI, big data, cloud, they're the best deal that we could get in terms of technology so far. How do you think that these solutions can actually rescue societies from the dictatorship, from for the freedom of speech, and obviously all these censorship? Do we need the decentralized platforms?
None of the things you mentioned will help. I mean, blockchain is a buzzword that doesn't really mean anything. And AI and big data analysis, as I said, I think are not helpful for civil liberties. These are going to consolidate power in the hands of corporations and governments and allow them to socially engineer and spy on their citizens. So, unfortunately, none of the things you mentioned. Well, what I suggest is a uptick in usage and a prioritization and more education about the other kinds of technologies that you didn't mention, which will help promote freedom and protect us in the digital age. Encryption being very important. So encryption, mass consumer hardware capable of recording a video. So more smartphones, more cheap consumer hardware, more encryption, more knowledge about how to use things like the Tor network or different VPNs, and very, very importantly, Bitcoin and its related technologies in it, like the Lightning Network. I mean, all of these things make a powerful toolbox for people to escape government surveillance and to opt out of their financial system. So those are the technologies I'd want to run with. Maybe a graphene phone, which is like a Android phone, which has all the surveillance stuff wiped out of it, or like a Copperhead. There's a couple different. It's like a special operating system. So go ahead and install that, and it's not linked to your ID. And then you can top up minutes. You can buy the minutes with cash or with Bitcoin. So it's not connected to your ID in any way. And then you have your little device, which is, as long as it's not connected to your ID. I mean, bear in mind that phones can still be tracked. There's things in phones that can track you. But look, as long as you're not connecting it to your ID, that's a step forward. And then you can start, trading messages with an encrypted messenger. Maybe you don't like Signal because it's tied to phone numbers, but there's others, that aren't, like Wire, etc. And then you can. Yeah, I don't know about that one. I mean, that one you're trusting
Russian,
trusting some Russian. Yeah, I mean, not that Russians are great, but you're trusting someone who could have a lot of connections with elites in Russia. You're just trusting. You're trusting a lot with that one. So yeah, definitely don't put anything that you should assume Telegram is like social media, that it's public. You should not do anything on Telegram that's private. That would be not a great idea. I mean, look, Signal, I think is safe to use, but just bear in mind that phone numbers can be revealing, right? And then, yeah, start to opt into this other financial system. I think this is what people can do. You gotta shrink the amount of information you're giving to the world if you're serious about fighting this trend that's happening. Yeah.
I totally agree. There are many restrictions to that. For example, I'm traveling at the moment. Obviously, I have to, use VPN, even though these countries you mentioned, they spend so much money on tackling the technologies that they cannot even control. Obviously, like VPNs, if you use a VPN, for example, in UAE, your internet will shut down. You have to turn your, VPN off, right? Or even though if you're using Bitcoin, they would take kind of like a court order to kind of like release all the information of the exchanges, or even if you are a citizen, they would require you to do or report all of your wallet, even though like if you didn't do any transaction. So what are the solutions to that? Like these are like fundamental rights that they
Well,
even find
I mean,
solutions to
the
tackle.
UAE is an authoritarian regime. So, I mean, the only way to fight back is with open source code. I mean, they're not like,
I mean,
you
not
know,
even UAE, even like some democratic countries are also doing that.
yeah, but I mean, at least in democratic countries, we can fight back. We can like go to court and we can sue our government. Like there's an organization not far from me that literally is like 50 lawyers just suing the US government, right? You're not
Is
going to
that
do that in the
citizen law?
UAE. EFF, the
Yes.
Electronic Frontier Foundation. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, not happening in the UAE. I mean, the UAE is a particularly pernicious slave state and dictatorship. And, you know, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that folks can do in the area of like seeking a legal recourse to human rights violations. However, I mean, there's not a whole lot they can, I mean, they can, yes, they can make things problematic for you, but like if you're using Signal, it's not like they can, they can't see what you've sent me. If you have messages on auto delete, even if they get your phone, I mean, they look into our history and they can't see anything. So, I mean, there's certain things that you can do to protect yourself. Likewise, there are ways to interact with Bitcoin that do not go through exchanges. So first of all, you could try to use an exchange that's in a geopolitical rival of the country that you're in, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. But for example, like that would be, you know, an unlikely scenario for like where it would be unlikely that your country's like doing intelligence sharing with the other country, right?
Mhm.
Like then maybe it's like if you have to, maybe you
Like
want to
data
maybe
extradition.
yeah, they're like it's not like the Iranian government is like hanging out with the U.S. government and sharing stuff. They're basically at like a cold war with each
You
other.
might be
So,
surprised.
well, I mean, maybe, but at least the pretense they make on stage is that they don't like each other, right? But the point is, like, there's certain things you can do there, but generally speaking, you don't want to use an exchange where you have to give data. You want to use like a peer-to-peer marketplace. You want to like directly connect with people, and that's how you want to use Bitcoin. If you're concerned, I mean, a lot of people have the privilege of living like me in a democracy where like we have protections and we have lawyers who can help us. But like for people under authoritarian regimes, it's like all they got is open source code. So yeah, be very careful about KYC. It's not, you should assume that like whenever you sign up for a Bitcoin service and you give your name and all this information, you should assume that your government is going to eventually be able to get that information at some point. Now, there's things you can do to mitigate that. Let's say you buy Bitcoin on an exchange in the UAE. Okay, the government knows that you've bought $1,000 of Bitcoin, and they're going to find out. Well, they probably also know what's in your bank account, right? Or they definitely know what's in your bank account. But you can, do they have ATMs in the UAE or no? Can you take cash? Does cash exist? Paper money?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Right. So you're right. Right. So they may know what's in your bank account, but when you withdraw it into cash, they don't know anymore. Okay. You've broken their ability to spy on you. Okay. Mm-hmm. Similarly, there are things you can do with Bitcoin. So you can withdraw your Bitcoin from an exchange, and then you can go into a coin join, which is like basically you can go into a collaborative spend with a lot of other Bitcoiners. And this way, people who are trying to spy on what's happening, they get lost. Okay. And then from there, you can go into the Lightning Network, or you can just save and not touch it. There's many different things you can do. The point is, these are technologies that you can use. They take time. They're not so simple to use. But if you care about it and money is important to you, just like your communications are important to you, thankfully now there are open source tools we can use for these things. So the good news is all this education is online for free. So you go, you start listening to these podcasts, you start understanding. Okay, then you can achieve some sort of sovereignty and freedom, even if you're in a country that's a little more repressive. So that's a good thing.
Thank you for explaining that. Obviously, I think the most challenging part would be the education, obviously educating specifically these people that are being even limited to the sources of those education, right? I mean, imagine like the podcasts, again, the rest of the world has the freedom of access, but then these countries, even the internet is sometimes being limited, obviously. Which goes to the next point, like what is the role of the international organizations like UN, United Nations, or even like World Economic Forum on the human rights?
They have no role. I mean, they're only negative. I mean, the UN is literally run by dictators. Like, I mean, the UN Human Rights Council is stacked with dictatorships, like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Cuba. They all rotate in and out of the Human Rights Council. Iran is on the women's rights body. Like this is a total hypocrisy. So they're not going to be helpful there. The World Economic Forum similarly is meant to maintain the status quo. So the status quo is essentially, the US and the EU and a bunch of dictators together, but they're very cooperative with each other. And that's not an easy power arrangement to unseat. But I think Bitcoin will do some damage. I really do. I mean, it's a system that they cannot control. And it's something that strikes at the very base of the power, which is the ability to control and create money and to set the rules of it so that they can benefit at everybody else's expense. And that's something that Bitcoin takes away from them. So people should opt into Bitcoin and get away from sort of this oligarchic control of our world. I think that's important to think about.
So tell us more about the World Human Rights Foundation and how you guys are playing obviously the biggest role now, because I mean, we see even the international organizations are not even active. As you mentioned, Iran is on the board of the Women's Right Committee. Is that right? So what is the role and how difficult is your foundation?
I mean, look, HRF works through like other human rights advocates. We kind of are an organization that tries to support existing good work in many ways. I mean, we do create our own research and we have lawyers and we help people, but sort of the end of the day, our approach is slightly different. We're like trying to learn from people on the ground and trying to support them and bring them to places where they can learn. And we want to empower them. That's kind of our strategy. So, I mean, that's why we're very different from like a centralized bureaucracy that is working with governments. Like we don't like work with governments. We work to try and expose governments, and we work to try and help the people who are trying to change the governments to make them more fair.
You mentioned about the whistleblowers. I wanted to know how difficult would that be? I mean, to kind of like help a whistleblower in that regard, and what are the legal issues that if your foundation would want to help a whistleblower, what are the legal aspects of that? Even you as US,
all whistleblowers face enormous risks. Obviously, even democratic whistleblowers face life in prison. I mean, look at some of the folks who exposed what the NSA was doing in the United States. I mean, Snowden he's sort of trapped in Russia. Assange is trapped in London. A lot of folks went to prison. I mean, so even in democracies, whistleblowers are paralyzed as sort of, but it seems formally. Obviously, in dictatorships, they're usually just killed without a big fuss. But everywhere, it's a problem, right? So look, again, it's through technology. I mean,
exactly. That's
Snowden communicated with Glenn Greenwald and these other reporters through PGP and through encrypted messaging. I mean, and I know the reporters at first were like, I don't want to do this, whatever. But like in the end, it was important, right? So there's something called Secure Drop, I believe, created by Freedom of the Press Foundation, which I think Snowden is involved with. So Secure Drop is a way that you can like leak something in a private way. That's the idea. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to get into, the point that now we see the technology, obviously open source technology with even like encryption and then blockchain and decentralization. It's even like so much easier to drop any kind of like information that you have without even being identified. Would that be also something like, I mean, at the moment with the current technology that is actually at the place, we could use, or not we, but like, I mean, in that regard could be used?
Look, I just think people should learn about Bitcoin and how to use it. I mean, how to be your own bank. There's nothing more powerful. I mean, there's a lot of buzzwords and marketing stuff out there, but at the end of the day, opting into a sovereign financial system that you control, literally you control, that no one can take from you or debase, is really like the most powerful thing right now. It's something that everybody should be focusing on. So I'd start with that, like learn about Bitcoin.
Where are we in terms of the adoption rate? I mean, obviously, we with the digitalization of technology this year, and with the COVID, we took a huge leap in adopting obviously different types of cryptocurrencies and obviously Bitcoin. At what rate do you think we are at the place that perhaps we could start being a kind of like a self-sovereign citizen?
Oh, I mean, people have been able to do that via Bitcoin for years. For 10 years, you could be self-sovereign essentially from the day it was created. It worked. The difference is now there's like thousands of people contributing to it, making it better. There's liquidity across the world in almost every country, in every major urban area on Earth. There's someone who's willing to buy your Bitcoin from you. So, I mean, we're dramatically much better off. But we're still at the very beginning. I mean, I think less than maybe 2 or 3% at most of the world has ever used Bitcoin. So we're obviously at the beginning. I think that number is going to go way up from here. So that's just my opinion.
I had a discussion with a few African kind of like citizens, and it's very, I mean, interesting that everybody there knows about cryptocurrency. I mean, how strange is that? What do you think the reason is? And now, obviously, there's like so much limited access to the internet, but then with obviously Starlink providing like internet to the remote areas, we're going to see how this kind of like play a huge role in countries that, for example, even the internet is being shut down by the governments, but then this is going to be a bigger impact or wave that they cannot even control because the source is not being provided, centrally by the governments, and obviously it's through satellites and Starlink. How do you think that this is going to create another wave in terms of the adaptation of either like cryptocurrencies, in terms of access to the internet and educating, people that, used to be deprived of that kind of like technology, and now it is kind of like sometimes going to be free, hopefully in the future, but now it's much more accessible.
Look, I mean, there's just more and more internet access. I mean, even in a country like Sudan or Ethiopia, you only have 20 or 25% of the population connected. But hey, that was 5% not that long ago, and it's going to 50% in the next few years. So even in like places that have like Ethiopia has 70% of the population lives in rural areas. I mean, even in a country like that, you're going to see massive change in terms of digitization. So it's just more opportunities for people to use open source software and liberate themselves and claim freedoms. No one's going to give you freedoms. You have to take them.